Some of you know from previous sermons or previous years that my grandfather, Rabbi Ernst Lorge of blessed memory, often shared with his congregation Jewish folk tales and stories. And from time to time, I do the same, especially on services when we expect we might have a lot more families with young children watching, as we suspect we might tonight for Simchat Torah. So I'm going to share a story that I found in one of the volumes that I have from his library. In a faraway kingdom, long ago, a boy was the only son of his parents, and they loved him dearly. He was the apple of their eye. And so when he turned 5, they knew it was time for him to begin to study Torah. The parents brought him to the synagogue, and they said to the rabbi, "When our child was born, we hired a sofer, we hired a scribe to write the book of Genesis, the book of Bereshit, just for him, so that when he began to learn Torah, he would begin with the beautiful story of God's creation." And the rabbi replied, "You know, it's not customary to begin with the book of Bereshit, to begin with Genesis. As Jews, we begin studying Torah, our children begin studying Torah with Vayikra, with the book of Leviticus. The scroll you have made, it's fine work and it's beautiful. But children at this age have to learn the priestly code. They have to learn about our rituals, about the sacrifices, about the temple. Leave your son's education to me." The parents were adamant. They said, "Why would we begin the story in the middle? And not at the beginning. We know that it's not customary. We know that most boys and most girls would begin studying Leviticus, but we want our child to learn first all of the wonders of creation." "That's just not how it's done," the rabbi said. And so the parents thanked the rabbi, and they walked out of the synagogue, and they went home. And on the way home, they said to their son, "We'll teach you ourselves." And so the next day, the parents took the scroll of Bereshit, of Genesis, that they had made with that scribe, and they unrolled it before their son, and they placed some honey near the first words. And they instructed him to lick up the honey. And as he did so, they said to him, as parents have done for thousands of years, "As honey is sweet, so shall these words of Torah and learning be sweet to you." And they kissed him upon his head, and they began to teach him from the first book of Torah. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. Each day, the boy sat and learned. The boy would repeat the words that he heard from his parents. He'd say back, "Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz ve'haaretz," and he'd go on. And then they would discuss the meaning of the words that they had chanted. And each day, the boy learned more. He asked more questions. He grew more curious. And he grew to love not only the words that he was learning, but also the world around him and all of the creatures and people he met, because he had learned from the start, from this book of Genesis, that all people were children of the same family, all having common ancestors with Adam and Eve. And he learned that all creatures and all people were beloved by the one true God. Now, not all was well in this kingdom. And though they didn't know it, the family lived at a time when the king was very troubled. So troubled, he couldn't sleep. Nothing soothed his soul. And his advisors didn't know what to do. And this is a tough place for an advisor to be in, because your job is to know what to do. And so they tried everything they could. And it's a particularly big problem for the advisors, because if the king was troubled, well, then they had to be troubled. And if the king wasn't sleeping, then they couldn't sleep. And if the king was grumpy, then they had to be grumpy too. And so they tried everything they could to soothe the king's soul. They brought in potion makers to create a sleeping potion, but that didn't work. They tried bringing in singers to lull him to sleep, but that didn't soothe his soul. So they tried harp players and flutes. They grew very desperate, and they brought in horns and drum players, and none of that soothed the king's soul. Trying to come up with something, anything. They tried jugglers and yodelers, entrancers and dancers, but nothing worked. "Let's try reading to the king," one of the advisors said. And so they went down into the great library, and shelf by shelf, they took books off and read them before the king until they had read almost every book in the library. But none of them soothed the king's soul. They found one book that they couldn't read, and the advisors pored over it, and one of them said, "I think this is written in the language of the Jews. Let's go find a Jew who will come and read it before the king." And so they sent soldiers out to the Jewish part of the kingdom to see if they could bring back someone who would help. Now, it must be known that while the kingdom was not a bad place to live as a Jew, it was also not the most amazing place to live as a Jew either. The Jews were tolerated, but they were considered not to be part of the kingdom. They were a separate people, and that's the way the kingdom liked them to be. And this put the Jews in a difficult position almost every single day, because they had to be cautious, and they had to be on their best behavior, lest they earn the anger and ire of the general people, or the nobles, or the church, or the king. They were worried that they'd be forced to flee if they did anything wrong. So when the soldiers came into their area of town, asking for someone to read a book before the king, the Jews were not so eager to go. So all of the elders from amongst the Jewish people gathered together, and they decided that they were not going to send anyone to go read that book. This was the king's problem. And they worried that if they went and they couldn't soothe the king's soul either, they might be blamed for all of the problems, maybe even for the great problems facing the entire kingdom. No, the king was on his own. This was not their king, not their people. They were not going to get involved. And so the elders returned to where the soldiers were begging for someone to read the book before the king. They approached the soldiers and they said, "You're right. The book you hold in your hands, it's in our sacred language, but none of us can read it. That is a book that has been lost to our people for some time now. None of us know how to read those words." Now, as they said that, who do you think walked by but that young boy who was so beloved by his parents? And he couldn't believe his ears. He looked at the book. He knew the words that were written there. He said, "Anyone can read the book that you have in your hands." Now, the soldiers didn't know what to do, confronted by a boy who said that anyone could read what they held. They said, "Can you read these words?" And the boy said, "Of course I can read those words." "Will you come with us?" the soldiers asked him. "Of course I will," said the boy. And the soldiers swiftly took the boy to the palace, brought him before the throne room where the king sat massaging his temples with his face scrunched up. And the boy stood before the king and began to read the words that were written in the book. Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz ve'haaretz. And he went on reading the book of Genesis as he knew it. The king looked up as he heard those words, his face unscrunched. And he sat back. He had never heard anything like it before. And after the boy finished chanting the first chapter, he said to the boy, "That was beautiful. What do those words mean?" And so the boy and the king began to discuss the story of creation. They discussed how all humanity are children of the same family, all descendants of Adam and Eve, how all people are connected by the one true God, and how all of us are made in the divine image. And the king was enthralled. He listened. He asked questions. He grew curious. He asked, "Will you come again tomorrow?" And the boy said, "Of course." And the king that night slept the soundest sleep he had slept in days. And in the days to come, the king soaked in all that the boy taught him. And having seen that while his customs were maybe different from those of the Jews, they were still all united and still all connected. And he began to change the way things happened in that kingdom. He grew kinder, more open-hearted, more generous, more charitable. His troubles, his worries, his cares melted away. And that was soon the way it was in the entire kingdom. The friendship between the boy and the king, it became a lifelong one. And everyone in the kingdom flourished. And the parents of that boy were the proudest they had ever been. For while everyone had learned to think of themselves first, to believe that their tradition and their teaching was true and deny everyone else's, to think that the differences separating them were greater than the commonalities, to learn to value their own kind and kin above their neighbors, their son had learned from Genesis, from Bereshit, from this first book of Torah, the first truth that Judaism sets out. That we are all children of the one true God. We are all made in God's image. And that if we act with that in our heart, the words of Torah are truly as sweet as the honey the boy licked up the first day he began studying and the first time he repeated, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz.